Absolutely. Here's the complete script. Combining all 15 sections into one continuous English narrative, as requested. Hey guys, tonight we're going on a journey. It's not to ancient Egypt or a bustling Roman forum, but into the quiet, often overlooked corners of medieval monastic life. Imagine, if you will, the flickering candlelight in a scriptorium, scratch of a quill on parchment, the crisp morning air chilling your breath as you rise long before dawn. You're there, huddled in a thick woolen habit, the scent of damp. Stone and old books filling your nostrils. Your day, every single day, is dictated by a rhythm so precise it would make a Swiss watchmaker weep with joy. The chiming of bells, signaling the next round of prayers, the next task, the next moment to offer yourself to a higher purpose. And at the heart of this meticulously orchestrated existence, the calendar. Yes, the humble calendar. The thing most of us glance at once. A day, if that, before checking our phones. But for medieval monks, the calendar wasn't just a grid of days. It was the very blueprint of their spiritual lives, an obsession, a puzzle, and a profound connection to the divine. You probably won't survive this level of chronological pedantry without falling asleep, which you know is the point, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling extra sleepy, maybe drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where everyone's tuning in from now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the chill, dimly lit cloister of an abbey, perhaps somewhere in what we now call France or England, around the 11th century. The air hums with a quiet devotion, punctuated only by the distant bleating of sheep or the gentle rustle of wind through the ancient trees surrounding. The monastic enclosure. Your life, as a newly professed monk, has been stripped of the worldly distractions you once knew. There are no social media feeds, no streaming services, no endless TikTok scrolls here. Instead, your existence is utterly defined by the herarium, the monastic schedule. This isn't a suggestion. It's a sacred contract, beginning with matins, long before dawn, and continuing through lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and finally, compline. Before you retreat to your communal dormitory for a few hours of sleep, only to repeat it all again. But how do you know when matins is? How do you know what psalms to recite, what feast day is being observed, or when to prepare for the profound solemnity of Easter? This is where the calendar becomes not merely a tool, but an almost sacred artifact. It's more than just marking days. It's about aligning your earthly, temporal existence with what was believed to be the eternal divine. Order. Every single monk, from the abbot to the newest novice, was deeply, intimately aware of the calendar's dictates. It permeated every aspect of their day, their year, their entire spiritual journey. Historians still argue whether the extreme regularity fostered greater spiritual discipline or simply a profound sense of routine-induced exhaustion. Probably both, if we're being honest. Consider the rhythm of the monastic day. It was based on the liturgical hours, which in turn were dictated by the position of the sun and, crucially, the specific calendrical date. You couldn't just wing it. If it was the feast day of St. Martin, for example, there would be specific readings, prayers, and perhaps even a special meal. Miss it, and you've not only failed in your personal devotion, but also disrupted the communal spiritual harmony of the entire abbey. It's like forgetting your best friend's birthday, only on a divine, eternal scale. This relentless adherence to the calendar meant that a substantial amount of intellectual energy within monasteries was devoted to its upkeep and understanding. It wasn't enough to just have a calendar. You had to understand how it worked, how to fix it, and how to project it into the future. This required a surprising amount of astronomical knowledge, a deep understanding of biblical chronology, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. It was far more complex than just flipping a page to July. You see, the calendar was the backbone of the liturgy. And the liturgy was the opus Dei, the work of God, the primary duty of the monastic life. Everything else, from farming to copying manuscripts, was secondary to this sacred rhythm. Commitment to precise timekeeping was, for its era, truly cutting-edge scientific and theological endeavor, pushing the boundaries of what was understood about the cosmos. For them, it wasn't boring at all. It was existence itself. The monks understood time not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing entity, a divine tapestry woven day by day. Every sunrise and sunset, every phase of the moon, every shift in the seasons was a reminder of God's presence in his meticulous design. They tracked these celestial movements with a diligence that would put modern-day astronomers to shame, albeit with far simpler tools. It was a physical and spiritual discipline, a way to prevent their souls from drifting aimlessly in an unmeasured world. Honestly, who needs Netflix when you have the intricate dance of the heavens to obsess over? They were the original data scientists, just with less caffeine and more chanting. This monastic preoccupation with the calendar wasn't just about personal piety. It had a profound ripple effect on the wider medieval world. Monasteries were often the intellectual hubs of their regions, and their mastery of timekeeping was invaluable. Imagine a farmer needing to know the optimal time to plant his crops, or a merchant planning a journey to a distant market town that coincided with a major religious festival. They'd often turn to the local abbey, knowing that the monks possessed the most accurate and reliable knowledge of the year's progression. It was a tangible service, a quiet but indispensable contribution to the fabric of medieval society. The monks, in their pursuit of divine order, inadvertently became the timekeepers for everyone else, whether they liked it or not. One mainstream historical fact to remember is that without the monastic commitment to precise calendrical calculations, much of what we understand about the medieval period's daily life and religious practice would be lost. Their detailed records, often found within the margins of these very calendars, provide invaluable insights into agricultural cycles, trade patterns, and even local weather phenomena. These seemingly mundane entries, driven by the need to track time, inadvertently created a rich archive of medieval existence. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some monastic calendars contained detailed instructions for things like the correct days for bloodletting, a common medieval medical practice believed to balance the body's humors, or when to prune grapevines. So, while profoundly spiritual, these documents were also pragmatic guides to health and horticulture. It really makes you appreciate your digital calendar, doesn't it? No weird medical advice pops up when you schedule a meeting. This intense focus on the calendar also fostered a unique intellectual environment. Within the scriptoriums, monks engaged in what was then cutting-edge astronomy and mathematics. It's not for abstract scientific inquiry, but for the very concrete purpose of worship. They meticulously copied, studied, and debated ancient texts on time, motion, and the cosmos, ensuring that this vital knowledge was preserved and propagated through centuries. This preservation, often overlooked, laid foundational groundwork for later scientific revolutions, proving that even seemingly boring pursuits can have monumental long-term impacts. They were basically coding the universe, one handwritten, day at a time. Now, as you settle into this rhythm, you begin to grasp the profound theological underpinnings of this calendrical obsession. For the medieval mind, time was not just a linear progression of seconds and minutes. It was a reflection of divine order, a sacred narrative unfolding. The creation of the world, the life of Christ, the anticipation of the second coming, all were embedded within a cosmic timeline ordained by God. To correctly understand and track this timeline was, in essence, to draw closer to the divine mind. You see, the monks weren't just being punctilious for the sake of it. They believed they were participating in the Ordo Mundi, the divine order of the universe. Think about it. The very act of knowing what day it was, not just broadly, but specifically, allowed them to commemorate the right saints, observe the correct fasts, and most crucially, prepare for the cyclical return of salvation events like Christmas and Easter. For a monk, missing a key liturgical celebration due to calendrical error wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a spiritual catastrophe, a missed opportunity for grace. It was like showing up to a very important, eternal job interview, completely unprepared, wearing flip-flops, and then asking if you can reschedule because you thought it was next Tuesday. Not a good look when your eternal soul is on the line. This conviction that the calendar was a mirror of cosmic order meant that any imperfection in its calculation was seen as a reflection of human fallibility, slight against divine perfection. So, the pursuit of calendrical accuracy became a form of piety itself. It was an intellectual discipline imbued with spiritual significance. Every calculation, every observation of the stars, every comparison of texts was, in a way, a prayer, an act of worship. It's a level of dedication, too. Precision that few of us encounter in our daily lives unless you're, say, a nuclear physicist or a neurosurgeon. For them, it was just Tuesday, or rather, the correct Tuesday of the second week after Pentecost, which, as any good monk would tell you, is a very different thing. One of the most mainstream historical facts about this era is that the Church was the primary patron and preserver of learning, and a huge chunk of that learning was devoted to what we would now call astronomy and mathematics, all funneled through the lens of calendrical necessity. They weren't building rockets, but they were definitely building intellectual frameworks that allowed for an astonishingly precise for the time. Understanding of celestial mechanics. It was the original big data problem, centuries before computers. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some monastic calendars actually included predictions for things like the best day to bleed oneself, a common medical practice then. Don't ask her when to plant certain crops. So while deeply spiritual, these calendars also served as proto-almanacs, blending the sacred with the surprisingly practical and sometimes medically questionable. It wasn't just about praying, it was about surviving and thriving too. Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on calendrical exactitude stifled or stimulated broader scientific inquiry. Did it funnel all intellectual curiosity into one narrow channel? Or did it provide a stable foundation and motivation for observation and calculation that eventually led to more diverse scientific pursuits? It's a bit of a chicken and egg. A situation, or perhaps a Gregorian calendar versus Julian calendar situation, which we'll get to later. Either way, for the monks, the calendar was the tangible link between the fleeting moments of their lives and the eternal, changing nature of God. It was their way of saying, "We see your cosmic plan, Lord, and we're doing our best to stick to the schedule." And they truly believed their salvation depended on it. This intricate dance between earthly observance and divine aspiration meant that the monk's life was a constant exercise in synchronicity. Imagine having to explain to a modern boss why you absolutely had to be late for that meeting because the moon was in the wrong phase for proper prayer. You'd be laughed out of the room, right? But for a medieval monk, it was the essence of their professional and spiritual obligation. Their very souls, they believed, were being calibrated by the celestial clock. And this wasn't some abstract theological concept. It had real daily implications. The exact time for a particular prayer service, the specific readings for a given feast day, the precise moment to begin a period of fasting, all these details were meticulously outlined and followed. It created a collective consciousness within the monastic community, a shared understanding of their place within the grander scheme of time and eternity. Furthermore, this pursuit of calendrical precision wasn't always easy. Mistakes were made. Debates raged, and different monasteries sometimes found themselves out of sync, leading to minor theological headaches. It highlights the human element in their divine pursuit. Even monks, dedicated as they were, could struggle with complex astronomical calculations or the interpretation of ancient texts. It speaks to their perseverance, their unwavering belief that this arduous intellectual labor was crucial. They weren't just marking days. They were attempting to decipher God's own timetable, a task both humbling and awe-inspiring. It's like trying to perfectly sync all your smart home devices, only on a scale that affects your immortal soul. A little more pressure, perhaps. The depth of this calendrical preoccupation also reveals the medieval worldview, or the sacred and the profane, were far more interwoven than they are today. The physical cosmos was seen as an active participant in human salvation, a giant clock winding down towards a final judgment. Every sunrise, every equinox, every full moon was a signpost on this journey, and the monks, as interpreters of these signs, held a vital role. Their calendars, therefore, were not just organizational tools, but spiritual roadmaps, meticulously crafted and guarded. They were, in essence, the GPS of the medieval soul. Now, let's zoom in on perhaps the single greatest calendrical headache and theological triumph for medieval monks, the calculation of Easter. You might think, Easter, big deal, it's just a Sunday in spring, right? Sweet summer child, if only it were that simple. For centuries, the date of Easter was a source of intense debate, confusion, and even schism across the Christian world. It wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a matter of orthodoxy, of celebrating the resurrection of Christ at the correct, divinely appointed moment. Get it wrong, and you might as well be wearing socks with sandals to a PayPal audience. The core problem, a mainstream historical fact, lies in the very nature of Easter itself. It's a movable feast, meaning its date isn't fixed to a specific day of the solar calendar like Christmas, which, by the way, wasn't always on December 25th. But that's a story for another sleepy night. Instead, Easter is tied to both the Passover, a lunar-based Jewish holiday, and the vernal equinox. Specifically, it's defined as the first Sunday after the first full moon that occurs on or after the vernal equinox. Easy peasy, right? Just look up the moon phases and the equinox. Except in the medieval period. Looking it up meant a whole lot of complex astronomical observation, computation, and dealing with the inherent inaccuracies of their available calendrical systems. Imagine being a monk in, say, the 8th century. Trying to figure this out, you don't have NASA data or a handy smartphone app. You're relying on ancient texts. Observations of the night sky often clouded or misted over, and hand-copied tables that might contain errors from centuries of transcription. This wasn't a solitary pursuit, it was a collaborative effort often, involving monks from different abbeys corresponding, comparing notes, and debating their calculations. The intellectual energy poured into this single problem, known as the computus, was immense. It was the medieval equivalent of trying to launch a satellite with only an abacus and a sundial. They were pretty good at it, all things considered. The method developed over centuries, primarily through the work of scholars like Bede the Venerable in the 8th century. Involved creating intricate tables that listed the dates of the full moons and the Sundays for years into the future. These tables were incredibly complex, factoring in the 19-year Metonic cycle, the period after which the phases of the moon recur on the same days of the solar year, and adjusting for the slight discrepancies between lunar and solar years. It was a mathematical dance of epic proportions, a true intellectual marathon for a quirky tidbit. One of the ongoing issues with the computus was the debate over which equinox to use as the starting point. Some traditions use the astronomical equinox, the actual moment the sun crosses the celestial equator, while others used a fixed ecclesiastical equinox, typically March 21st, regardless of the astronomical reality. This seemingly minor difference could lead to Easter being celebrated on different Sundays in different regions. It's causing genuine consternation and leading to heated, albeit polite, theological arguments among the cloistered academics. The medieval equivalent of Apple versus Android, but with eternal implications. Historians still argue whether the extreme focus on the computus hindered or advanced the broader understanding of mathematics and astronomy. On one hand, it certainly provided a strong impetus for intellectual rigor and the preservation of classical knowledge. On the other hand, its almost singular focus on solving this one problem might have diverted intellectual talent away from other areas of scientific inquiry. Was it a highly specialized, brilliant cul-de-sac, or a vital stepping stone? The dedication to solving the Easter problem underscores the monastic worldview. Their faith was not just about blind belief, but about a rational engagement with divine order. They believed God's universe was rational, predictable, and therefore understandable. Through diligent observation and calculation, This quest for calendrical precision, driven by the need to celebrate Christ's most important feast day correctly, highlights the profound interplay between theology, mathematics, and astronomy in the medieval mind. It wasn't just about getting the date right, it was about getting right with God. And for that, no amount of intellectual effort was too great. Imagine the relief, the quiet triumph. When the Easter date for the coming year was finally definitively calculated and inscribed onto the monastery's master calendar, it wasn't a moment for boisterous celebration, but a profound, silent affirmation of order restored, of divine harmony echoed in human understanding. This act of calculation was an act of faith, a rigorous intellectual prayer, ensuring that the entire community, and indeed, much of the Christian world connected to their abbey, would be in step with the liturgical rhythm of salvation. They were like the world's slowest, most meticulous supercomputers, all working on the same existential spreadsheet. This collaboration across monastic orders and geographical distances was remarkable. Letters and learned treatises on the computus would travel across Europe, monk scholars debating the finer points of lunar cycles and solar years, sometimes for decades. It fostered an international network of scholarly exchange, driven by this singular, shared problem. In an era without instant communication, this intellectual postal service was vital for maintaining a semblance of calendrical unity across Christendom. It proves that even when debating celestial mechanics, the medieval equivalent of snail mail still got the job done, eventually. The theological stakes were incredibly high. Different dates for Easter could imply different understandings of Christ's resurrection and its relationship to the Jewish Passover, risking charges of heresy, or at least significant disharmony within the broader church. Just mathematicians. They were theological guardians, protecting the integrity of the Christian message through their astronomical charts. It's a heavy burden knowing your numerical errors could lead to spiritual discord. No pressure, just the eternal fate of your community resting on your ability to correctly count. The complexity of the computus also led to the development of specialized knowledge and unique tools. Some monasteries would develop their own intricate Easter cycles multi-year tables, predicting the date of Easter, often based on their own unique historical observations or preferred mathematical models. These cycles became prized possessions, copied and recopied, sometimes even embellished. With beautiful illustrations, they were the medieval equivalent of proprietary software, meticulously guarded and highly valued. It shows that, even in the monastic world, a little bit of healthy competition, especially in the realm of complex calculations, was always on the calendar. Beyond the monumental challenge of calculating Easter, the monastic calendar served an equally vital, if less mathematically torturous, purpose. Organizing the dizzying array of feast days, saint celebrations, and agricultural cycles that structured medieval life. Imagine your Google Calendar, but instead of dentist appointment or pick-up dry cleaning, it's crammed with Feast of Saint Benedict, Vigil of the Assumption, First Plowing Day, and sheep shearing. This was not just a convenience, it was the very blueprint for spiritual and earthly survival. Every day, for a medieval monk, had a specific liturgical character. Some days were fast days, requiring abstinence from meat and other rich foods. Other days were feast days, often accompanied by special readings, more elaborate communal meals, and perhaps even a brief respite from manual labor. The calendar was the gatekeeper, dictating these shifts in routine. You couldn't just decide it was a feast day because you felt like a nice roasted chicken. The calendar decreed it, and the calendar was divine law, made meal planning both incredibly easy and utterly unspontaneous. No, what do you want for dinner, honey? The refector. Y. The sanctoral cycle, the sequence of saints' feast days, was particularly rich and complex. Every monastery would have its own specific additions to the universal church calendar, commemorating local saints, founding abbots, or significant events in their own history. These local observances were deeply meaningful, connecting the community directly to its spiritual heritage. It's like your hometown having its own unique public holidays that nobody else recognizes. You know, National Donut Day, but with more incense in Latin? This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. the vast majority of medieval calendars, even the highly spiritual ones, contained significant entries related to agricultural labor. Monasteries were largely self-sufficient economic units, and their survival depended on successful farming. The calendar, therefore, wasn't just a spiritual guide, but a practical almanac. It marked the optimal times for plowing, sowing, harvesting, vintaging, and animal husbandry. You would see entries like February, seed time, June, haymaking, or September, grape harvest. The rhythm of prayer was inextricably linked to the rhythm of the seasons. You couldn't pray on an empty stomach, after all. For a quirky tidbit, some monastic calendars contained rather explicit and sometimes graphic illustrations depicting the labors of the months. These miniatures would show peasants engaged in seasonal activities, slaughtering pigs in winter, pruning vines in spring, threshing grain in summer. While often depicted by monks, these illustrations were less about monastic duties and more about the wider, secular, agricultural world that supported the monastery. It's almost like they were including stock photos of real people doing real work. To remind themselves what was going on outside their cloistered walls, historians still argue whether the monastic emphasis on agricultural cycles within their sacred calendars reflects a pragmatic adaptation to necessity or a deeper theological understanding of humanity's role as stewards of creation. Was it simply a matter of survival, or did they see the divine hand in the bounty of the earth, making the calendar a testament to God's provision? Perhaps it was both, a seamless blend of the sacred and the earthly, reflecting a worldview where every aspect of life, from the highest prayer to the lowest chore, was imbued with spiritual significance. The monastic calendar, therefore, was a multi-layered document, serving as a liturgical guide, a historical record, and an agricultural timetable all at once. It was a tangible representation of the interwoven nature of spiritual devotion and practical living in the medieval period. Couldn't just be a spiritual monk who ignored the realities of the farm. Your prayers and your daily bread were intrinsically linked. This holistic view of existence, where every moment had its place and purpose, was deeply embedded in the monastic mind, and the calendar was its ultimate expression. Imagine, if you will, the anticipation within the community as a major feast day approached. Perhaps it was the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, a powerful patron. The calendar would have marked it weeks in advance. The tailor monk might prepare new vestments. The cook monk would plan a special, more abundant meal, perhaps even a little meat, if the rules allowed. And the prior would select specific readings and homilies. The anticipation built, not just for the spiritual graces, but for the communal joy and slight break in routine. These feasts were the medieval equivalent of a long weekend, except you spent it in church rather than at the beach. The practical implications extended far beyond the abbey walls. Local villagers, often dependent on the monastery for guidance and charity, would also look to the monk's calendar. When should they bring their grain for milling? When was the next market fair, often tied to a saint's day? When was the local tithe due, often calculated by harvest? The monastery, with its meticulously kept calendar, became a critical source of information, a central hub for the rhythm of the entire community. It was the medieval town crier, newspaper, and community billboard, all rolled into one parchment. Scroll this integration of agricultural time into the sacred calendar reinforces the idea that for medieval people, the divine was not distant, but intimately present in the physical world. The changing seasons, the growth of crops, the cycle of birth and death in the animal kingdom. These were all seen as manifestations of God's ongoing creation and providence. The calendar, by marking these moments, helped the monks and, by extension, the wider society, to acknowledge and give thanks for these blessings. It transformed mundane labor into an act of worship. Even the errors or slight variations in agricultural entries across different regional monastic calendars provide valuable data for modern historians. By comparing these notes, scholars can deduce local climate patterns, agricultural practices, and even specific crops cultivated in different areas. The monks and their desire for order inadvertently created a treasure trove of ecological and economic data that continues to inform us today. They probably didn't foresee their meticulous dating of carrot. Plantings would become a source for future pH, D, DISS, ERTAT. So, as you drift further into sleep, consider the monk poring over his calendar, not just for the next prayer, but for the precise moment to prune the vines, or when to bring in the sheep for shearing. His world was one where every single moment, whether sacred or mundane, was infused with purpose and diligently recorded, all thanks to that humble, yet utterly indispensable medieval calendar. It truly was the operating system of their lives. Now let's pull back the curtain on the actual creation of these monumental time-tracking devices. The production of monastic calendars and computist tables wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was an exacting, painstaking process of scribal, labor, and artistic embellishment. Imagine spending hours, days, weeks, meticulously writing out numbers and dates, knowing that a single misplaced stroke could throw off an entire year's liturgical schedule. It truly makes you appreciate copy-paste, doesn't it? You find yourself in the scriptorium, the heart of intellectual life in the monastery. The room is quiet, save for the scratching of quills, the rustle of parchment, and the occasional soft cough. The light, often scarce, filters through tall, narrow windows, supplemented by the dim glow of oil lamps or carefully guarded candles. The air is cool to preserve the parchment, and perhaps a little damp, carrying the faint scent of ink and vellum. As a monk assigned to this sacred task, your hands are steady, your focus unwavering. You are not just copying, you are preserving knowledge, creating a tool vital for the spiritual health of your community. The process began with the preparation of the parchment itself, animal skin. It's typically calf or sheep, meticulously cleaned, stretched, scraped, and smoothed until it became a suitable writing surface. This was a messy, labor-intensive business, far from the pristine paper we're used to. Then came the ruling. It's the careful drawing of faint lines and columns to ensure straight script and perfect alignment for the dates and numbers. Every single line had to be precise, as these calendars were often works of reference for decades, sometimes even centuries, to come. Think about trying to draw a perfect grid on a wobbly piece of leather after a long night of chanting. Tough gig. Then came the writing. The main text, typically in black or brown ink, would list the days of the month, often with a letter indicating the weekday ag for Sunday through Saturday, repeated, and a numerical entry for the moon's age. This formed the basic grid, but then came the crucial additions, the rubrics. These were entries written in red ink, indicating important feast days, the names of saints, and significant liturgical notes. The term rubric itself comes from the Latin ruber, meaning red, highlighting their visual prominence and importance. A mainstream historical fact is that the tradition of using red ink for special days on calendars persists to this day in many cultures. Look at almost any modern calendar and you'll likely see weekends and holidays in red. It's a direct lineage from these medieval monastic practices, the creation of these computist tables, the detailed calculations for Easter and other movable feasts, required an even higher degree of mathematical precision. These weren't just calendars, they were predictive instruments. They contained columns of numbers, sometimes hundreds of years into the future, listing lunar cycles, solar cycles, and their interplay. A single arithmetical error could propagate through the table, rendering years of liturgical dates inaccurate. This is why monks often worked in pairs or small groups, cross-referencing, checking, and rechecking each other's work. It was quality control on an existential level. For a quirky tidbit, some scribes would even include tiny, almost invisible, prickings or small holes along the edges of the parchment before ruling to ensure absolute vertical alignment of their lines and columns. This obsessive attention to detail, born out of a desire for accuracy and a respect for the sacredness of their work, speaks volumes about their dedication. It's the equivalent of having a pixel-perfect display. With a piece of animal skin and a needle, historians still argue whether the meticulous, repetitive nature of scribal work fostered a deeper, meditative state or simply led to chronic eye strain and carpal tunnel syndrome. Was the precise copying of texts and numbers a form of spiritual discipline? Or was it just really, really boring hard work? Probably a bit of both, knowing human nature. One can imagine the occasional frustrated sigh, quickly stifled as a spill of ink threatened to ruin hours of labor. The beauty of these calendars often extended beyond the simple text and rubrics. Many were exquisitely illuminated, adorned with intricate initial letters, border decorations, and small, vibrant miniatures depicting saints, biblical scenes, or the labors of the months, as we mentioned. These artistic elements weren't merely decorative. They served to reinforce the spiritual meaning of the text, to make the sacred accessible and beautiful. A calendar wasn't just a schedule. It was a work of art, a visual sermon, a constant reminder of the divine presence in every passing moment. The tools themselves were simple but effective. Quills cut from bird feathers, inks made from natural pigments, soot for black minerals, for red and blue, and finely ground gold leaf for gilding the most important elements. The application of gold was a delicate process, often involving applying gesso, a mixture of plaster and glue as a base, then laying the thin gold leaf and burnishing it to a high shine. This added an ethereal quality, catching the candlelight, and lending a sense of divine radiance to the calendar. It truly transformed a functional object into something precious and sacred. The role of the scribe in the monastery was therefore highly respected. They were not just copyists, but scholars, artists, and mathematicians, entrusted with preserving and propagating the essential knowledge of their time. Their work, though silent and hidden within the cloister, was fundamental to the spiritual and practical functioning of medieval society. They were the unsung heroes of time, ensuring that everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful king, could understand when to celebrate Easter, when to plant crops, and when to pray. It's a job description that definitely predates digital nomad.
Oh.
Despite the immense dedication and meticulousness of monastic scribes, the medieval calendar was far from perfect. It was, in fact, a work in progress for centuries, plagued by inherent inaccuracies that led to ongoing debates and gradual attempts at reform. You see, the calendar most of Europe was using was the Julian calendar. Introduced by Julius Caesar way back in 45 BCE, and bless his heart, Julius was great at conquering, but maybe not quite a celestial mechanic. The fundamental flaw in the Julian calendar, a mainstream historical fact, was its assumption that the solar year, the time it takes for the Earth to complete one orbit around the Sun, is exactly 365.25 days long. Sounds reasonable, right? Quarter of a day, every 4 years, you add a leap day, and everything stays perfectly aligned. Simple. Except, it's not exactly 365.25 days. The true length of the tropical year, the time between two successive vernal equinoxes, which is what matters for the seasons, and Easter, is actually closer to 365.2422 days now. That might seem like a tiny difference, barely a ripple in the fabric of time. But over centuries, those tiny fractions of a day add up. By the medieval period, particularly from the time of Bede in the 8th century onwards, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the calendar was drifting. The vernal equinox, which the Church insisted upon for the calculation of Easter, was occurring earlier and earlier than the calendar said it should. By the 15th century, the calendar was off by about 10 days, meaning the spring equinox was falling around March 11th or 12th, not the traditional March 21st. This was a pretty big deal when your holiest feast relies on that specific celestial alignment. It's like setting your alarm for 7 a.m., but it secretly decides to go off at 6:45 a.m. every day, and after a few months, you're just constantly early for everything and very, very tired. This drift caused significant anxiety for the monks. Not only did it mean that Easter was being celebrated at what was arguably the wrong time according to the true astronomical events, but it also messed with the fixed saints' days. The saint's feast day was traditionally celebrated on, say, the hottest day of summer. But the calendar had drifted so much that it was now falling in early autumn. It just felt ... off. It was a cosmic unsettling. A perceived disharmony between God's natural order and humanity's attempt to record it. For a quirky tidbit, one early attempt to address this issue, long before the major reforms, involved simply moving the official date of the equinox in the liturgical calendar. So, if the actual equinox was drifting, some simply declared, well, for our purposes, the equinox is still March 21st, even if the sun says otherwise. This was a bit like declaring that 2 + 2 = 5 because it's easier than doing complex math. It didn't solve the underlying astronomical problem, of course, but it kept the liturgical peace for a while. Historians still argue whether the Church's initial reluctance to embrace radical calendrical reform stemmed from a deep-seated conservatism, a lack of scientific understanding, or a pragmatic desire to avoid widespread confusion and further schism. It wasn't as simple as just correcting a number. It involved deeply entrenched traditions, biblical interpretations, and the delicate balance of authority within a vast and diverse religious institution. It's hard enough to get people to agree on what to have for lunch, let alone to fundamentally change the way they measure time. The monks, being the primary custodians of this knowledge, were acutely aware of the problem. They were the ones meticulously tracking the equinoxes, comparing their observations with ancient texts, and seeing the discrepancy grow year after year. Their work on the computus, while focused on calculating Easter, also served to highlight the Julian calendar's shortcomings. They were the canary in the coal mine, constantly chirping, "Hey, this calendar's a little off." To an audience that wasn't quite ready to listen, even though large-scale reform wouldn't come until the late 16th century with the Gregorian calendar, these medieval monks, through their persistent observation and calculation, laid the groundwork for it. They compiled the data, developed the mathematical tools, and, most importantly, kept the problem alive in scholarly discourse. Without their centuries of meticulous record-keeping and their quiet insistence on accuracy, the eventual reform might have been far more difficult, or perhaps never happened at all. They were like the diligent interns who do all the boring groundwork for the big project that someone else will get famous for. This slow, centuries-long realization of calendrical error underscores a key aspect of medieval intellectual life. Knowledge was often built incrementally, through patient observation and the accumulation of data. There were no sudden scientific revolutions in the same way we might conceive of them today. Instead, it was a gradual process of understanding, debate, and subtle correction. It really makes you appreciate instant updates on your phone, even. If they sometimes break everything, the consequences of this calendrical drift weren't just theological, they were also practical. Farmers might sow seeds based on traditional calendar dates that no longer accurately reflected the season, leading to suboptimal yields. Sailors, relying on celestial navigation, might find their calculations subtly off. While perhaps not catastrophic on a daily basis, these accumulated inaccuracies could lead to broader inefficiencies and frustrations. It just wasn't as harmonious as it should be, and the medieval mind craved harmony with the divine. So, as the centuries unfolded, the monks continued their quiet work, documenting the drift, discussing solutions, and inadvertently preparing the intellectual landscape for a future change that would, when it finally came, shake Europe. But that's a story for a slightly less sleepy time. For now, remember their silent struggle against the creeping inaccuracy of time itself. So, how exactly did these medieval monks, without telescopes, satellites, or even reliable clocks in the SE modern sense, manage to track celestial movements with enough precision to even notice the Julian calendar's drift? They used surprisingly simple yet effective astronomical tools and humble observances. It wasn't about high-tech gadgets, but about patient, repeated, and often ingenious application of basic principles. Imagine trying to chart the stars with nothing more than a piece of string and a keen eye. That was essentially their daily grind. One of the most fundamental tools at their disposal was the gnomon. This is simply a vertical stick or pillar, often part of a sundial. By observing the length and direction of its shadow throughout the day and year, especially at noon, monks could Track the sun's apparent movement. The shortest shadow at noon indicated the summer solstice. The longest indicated the winter solstice. And the shadows of equal length at certain times of the year pointed to the equinoxes. A mainstream historical fact is that sundials, in various forms, have been used for millennia across many civilizations. And monastic communities refined their use for precise time and seasonal tracking. They were the original smartwatches, just a lot slower and powered by a giant fusion reactor. Monks also relied on careful observation of the stars. While they didn't have telescopes to gaze at distant galaxies, they were intimately familiar. With the constellations and their movements across the night sky, they would observe the rising and setting times of specific stars, especially at dawn and dusk, which provided clues about the progression of the seasons. For example, the Halaya code just before sunrise rising of certain bright stars could indicate the approach of an equinox or solstice. This kind of naked-eye astronomy required immense patience and a deep knowledge of the heavens, passed down through generations of monastic scholars. It was like their version of cloud gazing, but with actual cosmic significance. The astrolabe, while more complex and less common in every monastery, medieval period, it allowed users to determine the time of day or night, the position of celestial bodies, and even to cast horoscopes, though the latter was more for secular scholars. For monks, its utility lay in its ability to pinpoint the precise altitude of stars and the sun, which was crucial for accurate calendrical calculations, especially for the elusive Easter date. A monk with an astrolabe was basically walking around with a supercomputer in their hand, capable of complex astronomical calculations on the go. For a quirky tidbit, some monasteries even developed specific architectural features designed for astronomical observation. These could include carefully placed windows or holes in walls that would align with the sun at the precise moment of the equinox or solstice, casting a beam of light onto a specific mark on the floor. These fixed observational points acted as large-scale, immovable astronomical instruments, silent witnesses to the sun's journey through the year. Imagine your abbey having a built-in light show. It's all designed for science and salvation. Historians still argue whether the practical need for accurate timekeeping for liturgical purposes was the primary, a driver for astronomical study in monasteries, or if a genuine intellectual curiosity about the cosmos also played a significant role. Was their science purely utilitarian, or did it also stem from a pure love of knowledge and wonder at God's creation? It's likely a blend of both, but the emphasis on calendrical accuracy certainly provided the consistent funding and motivation. After all, if you wanted to pray on time, you had to understand time. The monastic commitment to observation was not merely about individual accuracy, but about communal discipline. Monks would often cross-reference their readings, comparing the shadow length from the gnomon with the positions of the stars and the readings from their tables. This collective vigilance helped to minimize errors and refine their understanding of the celestial rhythms. They were the original citizen scientists. Just with more robes and less social media, they also understood the importance of historical data. They preserved and studied ancient astronomical texts from Greek, Roman, and even Arabic scholars. Comparing these historical observations with their own contemporary findings, this cumulative knowledge allowed them to track the long-term drift of the Julian calendar and begin to grasp the necessity of reform. They were building a massive analog database of time, one observation at a time, for centuries. And they did it all without Excel spreadsheets. The monks' connection to the natural world was profound. They lived immersed in its rhythms, there. Lives dictated by sunrise and sunset, moon phases and seasons. This intimate familiarity made them exceptionally skilled observers. They noticed subtle changes that modern city dwellers, divorced from the natural world by electric lights and artificial environments, often miss. Their monasteries, often located in quiet, isolated areas, provided ideal conditions for undisturbed observation of the night sky, free from light pollution. It was a natural laboratory, gifted by God and good real estate planning. This level of detailed, consistent observation laid crucial groundwork. It wasn't until the Renaissance, with more advanced mathematics and the development of the printing press, which allowed for wider dissemination of these findings. That the call for calendrical reform gained unstoppable momentum. But the seeds were planted by centuries of patient, humble, often sleepy monks, squinting at the sun and stars from their cold cloisters. They were the quiet revolutionaries, meticulously gathering the evidence that would eventually overturn a 16th-century-old system, while Western monasticism grappled with the intricacies of the Julian calendar. A parallel, equally devout, and often very different world of monasticism existed in the East. This brings us to the fascinating topic of the Great Divide, East versus West, specifically regarding their calendrical practices and how these differences played into broader theological and cultural divergences. You see, it wasn't just about who had the better formula for Easter. It was about differing worldviews and liturgical traditions that had been evolving for centuries. The Eastern Christian tradition, primarily the Orthodox Church, largely continued to use the Julian calendar for its liturgical year, even after the West eventually adopted the Gregorian calendar. This commitment to the old calendar, often referred to as the Old-Style calendar, became a point of deep spiritual and historical identity. A mainstream historical fact is that many Orthodox churches to this day still calculate their feast days, including Easter, according to the Julian calendar, which means their Easter often falls on a different Sunday than that of Western Christianity. Imagine attending a family reunion where half the family celebrates Christmas on December 25th and the other half on January 7th. It creates some interesting scheduling conflicts, to say the least. The roots of this divergence go way back. It's predating the Great Schism of 1054 that formally split the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. While both East and West agreed on the fundamental rule for Easter first Sunday after the first full moon on or after the vernal equinox, they sometimes differed on the specific methods of calculation, the astronomical tables they used, and the precise definition of the vernal equinox. The East, for instance, often insisted that Easter must fall after the Jewish Passover, whereas the West, while respecting this, did not make it an absolute unbreakable rule in all cases. These subtle differences over centuries led to the occasional divergence in the actual date of Easter, creating two distinct calendrical traditions for the Eastern monks. Their calendrical practices were deeply intertwined with their theological emphasis on continuity and tradition. To change the calendar felt like altering a sacred inheritance, a break from the practices of the early church fathers. The West, in contrast, eventually embraced the idea of reform for the sake of scientific accuracy and liturgical alignment. With true astronomical events, it was a clash between theological conservatism and scientific pragmatism. Cloaked in robes and debates about lunar cycles, it's like arguing over whether to upgrade your phone's operating system, one side says. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. The other says, but the new one has better battery life and cool emojis. For a quirky tidbit, one of the practical implications of these differing Easters was what became known as the Paschal controversy. For centuries, when traders or pilgrims from the East met those from the West, there could be confusion and even tension over why their holiest feast was celebrated on different days. Imagine two groups of pilgrims arriving at the same sacred site, only to discover one group is celebrating a solemn Good Friday, while the other is already feasting on Easter Sunday. Awkward. It was a visible sign of a deeper theological and cultural divide. Historians still argue whether the calendrical differences were a primary cause or merely a symptom of the broader theological and political schism between East and West. Did the inability to agree on a common Easter date contribute to the growing divide, or was it simply another manifestation of a separation that was already well underway? It's a complex chicken and egg scenario, but it certainly served as a highly visible, recurring reminder of the fracture. The monastic communities in both traditions were the custodians of these distinct calendrical practices. In the East, monks meticulously maintained their Julian-based Paschal tables, ensuring the continuity of their liturgical rhythm. In the West, as we've seen, monks were increasingly engaged in identifying the Julian calendar's flaws and beginning to advocate for reform. Their respective approaches to time reflected their broader theological and intellectual inclinations. The Eastern monastic tradition, often characterized by a greater emphasis on mysticism and spiritual contemplation, saw the Julian calendar as part of an unchanging, sacred cosmic order. Their calendrical work was less about fixing an error and more about faithfully preserving a divinely inspired system. It wasn't broken. It was simply the right way, the way of their ancestors. This contrasts with the Western inclination towards rational inquiry and systemization. Even when it meant challenging established norms, even the aesthetics of their calendars could reflect this difference. While both traditions produced beautiful illuminated manuscripts, Eastern Orthodox calendars might emphasize different iconographic traditions and less focus on astronomical tables. In favor of more theological or hagiographical content stories of saints' lives, it's like comparing two different art museums, both beautiful, but with distinct curatorial philosophies. This enduring calendrical divide highlights the deep-seated nature of religious and cultural identity. For many Orthodox Christians, adhering to the Julian calendar became a mark of their distinct spiritual heritage, a continuity with the early church that they felt the West had abandoned in its pursuit of reform. It was a powerful symbol, a temporal anchor in a rapidly changing world. And sometimes, sticking to the old ways, even if slightly less accurate by scientific standards, can be a profound act of faith and identity. So as you drift off, consider the vast, complex tapestry of medieval Christian timekeeping, split into two major threads, each diligently woven by dedicated monks, united by faith but subtly divided by the very calendars that guided their daily prayers. It's a testament to how even the most mundane details, like a date on a calendar, can hold profound spiritual and cultural significance. While monks meticulously managed their calendars for internal liturgical and spiritual purposes, their expertise had a profound and often overlooked impact on the wider secular world. The monastic calendar wasn't just some dusty, cloistered artifact. It was a crucial reference point for the rhythms of daily life outside the abbey walls, from trade routes to planting seasons and local festivals. You see, in a world without common digital clocks or widely distributed printed calendars, the monastery was often the most reliable source of time itself. Imagine yourself as a medieval peasant, living in a small village adjacent to a grand abbey. Your life is dictated by the sun and the seasons, but also by market days, religious holidays, and the timings of crucial agricultural tasks. How do you know when to bring your surplus grain to the nearest town fair? Or when the annual tithe? A percentage of your produce given to the church is due. You'd look to the monastery. The chiming of their bells wasn't just a call to prayer. It was the most consistent timepiece in the region. Monks' mastery of the calendar thus translated directly into practical guidance for the lay community. It was the original local news and weather channel, just a lot slower and with more Latin, a mainstream. Historical fact is that many medieval market fairs and court sessions were deliberately scheduled to coincide with major Christian feasts. Days. These dates, precisely calculated and disseminated by the church and by extension. The monasteries provided fixed points in the year around which secular activity could revolve. If the Feast of St. Giles was known to be a major market day, merchants from miles around would converge, confident that others would do the same. This calendrical synchronization facilitated commerce and social gatherings across vast distances, connecting disparate communities. It's like everyone agreeing to meet on a specific date for a big sale, except the date is determined by lunar cycles and saintly anniversaries. The agricultural calendar, as we briefly touched upon, was perhaps the most direct example of monastic knowledge influencing lay life. Farmers, relying on centuries of inherited wisdom, would often consult the monks or simply observe the monastic schedule to guide their planting, harvesting, and animal husbandry. When the monks started their spring plowing, it was a signal for the villagers. They celebrated the feast of St. John the Baptist around the summer solstice. It might mark the beginning of haymaking season. The rhythm of the liturgical year became deeply intertwined with the rhythm of the land. It was practical, vital knowledge, ensuring food on the table, both for the monks and for everyone else. For a quirky tidbit, some local calendrical practices even dictated the timing of legal proceedings or debt repayments. Imagine owing a few silver coins to a neighbor, with the repayment deadline set for the Feast of the Holy Cross. The precise date, known only through the Church's careful calculations, literally defined when your financial obligations came due. It gave a whole new meaning to time is money, with a side of divine intervention. It was less about credit scores and more about celestial schedules. Historians still argue whether the Church's provision of calendrical certainty to the secular world was an act of benevolent social service or a subtle way of embedding its authority deeper into the fabric of daily life. Was it simply a practical necessity or a means of demonstrating the Church's indispensable role in ordering both spiritual and temporal affairs? Likely it was both. A natural symbiotic relationship where practical need met spiritual authority. The monks, in their quiet scholarly pursuits, became the unexpected anchors of temporal stability for a largely illiterate and unmeasured world. They were the ones who understood the complex algorithms of time, the ones who could predict the changing seasons and the holy days, thereby allowing everyone else to plan their lives with a degree of certainty. Without their work, medieval life would have been far more chaotic, less synchronized, and arguably less productive. Trade routes in particular benefited immensely from this calendrical precision. Merchants undertaking long journeys across continents needed to know when major feasts occurred, not only to avoid travel on holy days, but also to time their arrivals at cities during peak market seasons, which, as noted, often coincided with religious festivals. The monastic calendar, even indirectly, became a crucial navigational tool for commerce, as vital as a good map or a sturdy horse. It made business trips actually possible across long stretches of time and space. Even the very naming of weeks and months, or the common parlance of the day, reflected this calendrical dominance. People might refer to events happening after Michaelmas, the Feast of St. Michael, September 29th or before Christmas, using these ecclesiastical markers as common reference points. It became embedded in the very language of time, a constant reminder of the Church's omnipresent influence. This interplay between monastic, calendrical knowledge and secular life also highlights the limited scientific literacy outside the monastic orders. While some educated lay people and court scholars existed, the most concentrated, systematic, and continuous study of astronomy and computus resided within the abbeys. They were the experts, the intellectual elite of time management, and everyone else implicitly or explicitly relied on their expertise. It was a true monopoly on chronological information. So as you drift into dreams, picture the quiet, methodical monk, diligently marking his calendar in the scriptorium, utterly unaware that his precise lines and red rubrics are not just guiding his abbey's prayers, but also determining when a farmer sows his wheat, when a merchant sets out on a journey, and when a whole village gathers for its annual fair. Their boring obsession with time made the medieval world tick. Where did all this calendrical knowledge reside? Out on the cloud, certainly. It was carefully guarded, studied, and expanded within the hallowed halls of the monastic libraries. These were far more than just quiet rooms filled with dusty books. They were the nerve centers of medieval scholarship, the repositories of ancient wisdom, and the workshops where the future of time itself was quietly being forged. You're stepping into a true intellectual sanctuary, bathed in the soft glow of natural light or flickering candles. The scent of aged parchment heavy in the air. Imagine rows upon rows of shelves. It's crammed with large, heavy tomes, many of them bound in thick leather or wood, their spines often bearing only cryptic titles, or no titles at all. These weren't thrillers or romance novels. These were the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Within these libraries, amidst theological treatises and biblical commentaries, you would find significant collections of astronomical and computus texts. These were the essential manuals for understanding time, the cosmos, and the precise calculation of liturgical dates. A mainstream historical fact is that monastic libraries played an absolutely critical role in preserving classical learning and scholarship throughout the early and high Middle Ages, serving as vital bridges between the ancient world and the burgeoning intellectual life of later centuries. Without them, much of ancient science and philosophy would have been lost to us forever. For a monk studying the calendar, these texts were his primary source material. He would pore over the works of ancient Greek and Roman astronomers like Ptolemy, whose geocentric model of the universe dominated medieval thought. He would consult the writings of early church fathers who had debated the Easter calculation. And, crucially, he would study the Computus manuals developed by his monastic predecessors, such as Bede the Venerable's De Temporum Ration on the reckoning of time, which became a standard textbook for centuries. These texts weren't just read, they were copied, annotated, debated, and updated, forming a living tradition of scholarship. It was their version of peer-reviewed journals. It's just a bit slower to publish. The challenge isn't just having the books, but understanding them. Many of these texts were written in complex Latin or, in the case of some imported Arabic or Greek works, required translation. The monastic scholars who dedicated themselves to calendrical studies were often highly educated. Multilingual individuals possessing a deep understanding of mathematics, geometry, and astronomy, all for the humble purpose of getting the date right. They were the original interdisciplinary scholars long before anyone invented the term. For a quirky tidbit, some monastic libraries had rather unusual systems for organizing their precious manuscripts. Instead of alphabetical order, books might be shelved by size, by subject with astronomy, often lumped in with mathematics or even theology, or simply by the order in which they were acquired. Finding a specific Computus text might involve a bit of a treasure hunt, requiring intimate knowledge of the library's eccentricities. It's like your quirky old relative's house, where you know everything is somewhere. You just need to remember which pile it's in. Historians still argue whether the physical isolation of monastic libraries, preserving knowledge, also limited its wider dissemination and intellectual development. Did the cloistered nature of these institutions restrict the free flow of ideas that might have accelerated scientific progress? Or was their quiet, protected environment precisely what was needed to safeguard delicate knowledge through turbulent times? It's a debate about the merits of deep, specialized knowledge versus broad, open access. The library was also where new calendars and Computus tables were drafted, tested, and finalized. It was a workshop as much as a reading room. Monks would sit at Carroll's small study desks, often built into the walls, surrounded by reference books, their quills scratching as they performed long, arduous calculations. The silence was not empty, but filled with the hum of intellectual labor, a quiet pursuit of understanding the universe, one number at a time. These libraries weren't just static collections. They were dynamic centers of intellectual activity. Monasteries would often engage in a vigorous exchange of manuscripts with other abbeys, sharing new discoveries, improved calculations, and updated astronomical data. This network of knowledge exchange, fueled by the slow but steady production of new copies, ensured that calendrical scholarship evolved, albeit slowly, across Europe. It was the medieval internet, just a lot slower to download. The value placed on these texts was immense. They were not simply paper and ink. They were the very fabric of time, the key to understanding God's order. They would be rebound, repaired, and meticulously cared for, often remaining in active use for centuries. When you hold an ancient Computus manuscript today, you're not just touching history. You're touching the culmination of generations of monastic obsession. So as you drift off to sleep, picture the quiet, dedicated monk, surrounded by towering shelves of ancient knowledge, his brow furrowed in concentration as he deciphers the secrets of the heavens, all contained within the pages of a book. The monastic library, silent and profound, was truly where time was kept. It's easy to think of medieval monasteries as austere, monochrome places filled with serious monks and dull parchments. But if you've been imagining plain utilitarian calendars, you've missed a crucial, vibrant dimension. the illustrations gilding, and beauty that elevated many monastic calendars to genuine works of art. These weren't just functional timetables. They were visual sermons, infused with symbolic imagery and intricate designs that made the sacred readable and beautiful to the eye. You might encounter a calendar that begins each month with a large, elaborate initial letter, perhaps twisting into fantastic animal forms or depicting a small scene relevant to the month's main feast day. Then, throughout the month, tiny, jewel-like miniatures would appear next to significant dates. These weren't just randomly placed. They served as visual mnemonics, helping the reader recall the importance of a particular day. Seeing a small depiction of a martyrdom next to a date would instantly tell you it was a saint's day. Even if you couldn't read the Latin text perfectly, it was the medieval equivalent of an emoji, but a lot more detailed and expensive. The gilding was particularly striking. Using painstakingly prepared shell gold, finely ground gold mixed with binder, applied with a brush or delicate sheets of gold leaf, scribes and illuminators would highlight important elements, the numbers of significant feast days, the names of major saints, or the borders of a miniature. This wasn't just for show. Gold, being a precious metal that reflects light, was seen as a symbol of divine light, eternity, and heavenly glory. When candlelight flickered over a gilded calendar page, it would seem to shimmer and glow, transforming the mundane act of reading a date into a moment of spiritual awe. It gave the humble calendar an almost ethereal quality, making it feel less like a schedule and more like a holy relic. A mainstream historical fact is that the art of illuminated peak in the high and late Middle Ages, and calendars, along with books of ours, were among the most frequently and beautifully illuminated texts. The quality and richness of these illuminations often reflected the wealth and prestige of the monastery that commissioned or produced them. A particularly opulent calendar could be a testament to an abbey's artistic prowess and spiritual devotion. For a quirky tidbit, some calendar illustrations contain subtle, almost humorous details of daily life or even social commentary. Hidden within the borders or background of a religious scene, you might see a tiny peasant scratching his head next to an image of a saint or a mischievous animal peeking out from behind an initial letter. These little human touches served as a playful counterpoint to the solemnity of the main text, a reminder that even in monastic life, there was room for a smile. It was like finding a secret Easter egg in a serious video game. Historians still argue whether the increasing elaborateness of calendar illuminations was primarily a theological effort to make sacred time more accessible and inspiring, or if it also reflected a growing interest in artistic expression and patronage for its own sake. Was beauty a means to an end, spiritual edification, or was it increasingly valued for its inherent aesthetic appeal? It's likely both, as art and faith were deeply intertwined in the medieval period, much like how a beautifully designed app can be both functional and pleasing. The process of illumination was often separate from the scribal work. Once the text and rubrics were written, the vellum page would be passed to an illuminator, a highly skilled artist who would apply the pigments and gold. Pigments were derived from minerals, plants, and even insects, resulting in a surprisingly rich and varied color palette. Deep indigos, vibrant greens, earthy reds, and luminous yellows. Each color had to be painstakingly ground and mixed with a binder, then applied with tiny fine-tipped brushes. It was a slow, meticulous process, requiring infinite patience and a steady hand. The artistic conventions were also distinctive. Medieval illuminations often featured a flat perspective, limited depth cues, and figures that, to modern eyes, might seem somewhat stylized or elongated. This wasn't due to a lack of skill, but a deliberate artistic choice. The goal wasn't realism, in the modern sense, but symbolism and clarity. The focus was on conveying spiritual truth, not photographic accuracy. So a saint might appear larger than life, not because he was a giant, but because his spiritual importance dwarfed everything else. These visual elements reinforce the calendar's role as a guide to both the sacred and the seasonal year. The Labors of the Month series, popular in many calendars, beautifully depicted agricultural activities tied to each month, often alongside the zodiac signs. So, a page from March might show a farmer pruning vines in the constellation Aries, while also listing the feast of St. Patrick. It integrated cosmic, agricultural, and liturgical time into a single, visually rich tapestry. The beauty of these calendars wasn't just appreciated within the monastery. They were often highly prized possessions that could be gifted to powerful patrons or other monastic houses, spreading both their calendrical knowledge and their artistic influence. They were, in a very real sense, diplomatic tools, showcasing the monastery's piety, scholarship, and artistic excellence. As the medieval period drew to a close and the first stirrings of the Renaissance began to be felt, the exclusive domain of calendrical knowledge began to shift. The meticulous, cloistered work of the monks, while foundational, eventually transitioned into a more formalized academic pursuit. This is the story of how calendrical science moved from abbey walls to academia, laying the groundwork for a new era of scientific inquiry. For centuries, if you wanted to study astronomy, mathematics, or timekeeping, the monastery was often your best, if not only option. Monks were the primary custodians of these disciplines, driven by the theological necessity of the computus. However, with the rise of universities from the 12th century onwards, places like Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Cambridge, a new intellectual landscape began to emerge. These institutions, initially rooted in theological studies, gradually expanded to include faculties of arts, law, and medicine, fostering a more secular approach to learning. A mainstream historical fact is that early universities drew heavily on the intellectual capital developed in monasteries. Many of the first university scholars were former monks or clerics trained in monastic traditions who brought their knowledge of logic, rhetoric, mathematics, and of course, calendrical science into these new urban centers of learning. It was like the world's first intellectual tech transfer, with the monastic startups quietly laying the groundwork for the bigger, splashier university corporations. The difference lay in the purpose of the study. While monks studied the cosmos primarily to serve the liturgy and understand divine order, university scholars began to pursue these subjects with a growing sense of intellectual curiosity for their own sake. Astronomy moved beyond just calculating. Easter, becoming a field of study in its own right, concerned with mapping the stars, understanding planetary motion, and refining observational techniques. This wasn't an overnight shift, but a gradual, subtle evolution in intellectual motivation. For a quirky tidbit, some early university curricula included mandatory study of the computus, often taught by former monks. So, even as learning moved outside the abbey, the monastic obsession with calendars persisted, forming a core part of a scholar's foundational education. It's a bit like how we still study classical literature, even if we're training to be software engineers. Understanding the roots of knowledge, historians still argue whether the intellectual output of monasteries declined significantly with the rise of universities, or if they simply continued to play a different, perhaps more specialized role in the broader intellectual ecosystem. Did monasteries become less innovative, or did they simply cede the cutting edge of certain fields to the new university model, while retaining their unique focus on spiritual and liturgical scholarship? The answer is complex with varying trends. Across different regions and orders, university scholars, unlike their monastic counterparts, often had access to a wider range of texts, including newly translated Arabic and Jewish works that contained more advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge. They also benefited from a more open intellectual environment, where debates could be more vigorous and less constrained by immediate theological imperatives. This led to a flourishing of new ideas and further refinements in calendrical science. Development of sophisticated astronomical tables, often compiled by university scholars, surpassed the complexity of earlier monastic computus tables. These tables were designed for a broader audience, including navigators, astrologers, which was still considered a legitimate science then, and even just curious intellectuals. The printing press, when it arrived in the 15th century, further accelerated this dissemination of knowledge, making these tables and calendrical treatises available to a much wider public. Outside the confines of monastic or university libraries, this shift didn't mean the end of monastic involvement in calendrical matters. Far from it. Many monks continued to be highly skilled astronomers and computists, and some monasteries continued to be centers of learning. However, the intellectual leadership in these fields began to migrate. The universities, with their larger student bodies, competitive intellectual environment, and increasing patronage from secular rulers, became the new engines of scientific advancement. The monastic legacy, however, remained vital. The centuries of meticulous observation, the preservation of ancient texts, and the intellectual discipline fostered within abbey walls provided the essential foundation upon which the nascent university science could build. Without the boring obsession of the monks, the academic pursuit of calendrical accuracy would have started from a much more primitive place. They were the intellectual grandfathers of modern astronomy, patiently collecting data long before anyone even thought of a Big Bang. This transition also marks a broader cultural shift, where knowledge began to be valued not just for its spiritual utility, but for its intrinsic truth and its practical application in a rapidly evolving secular world. It was a slow but profound reorientation of intellectual priorities, ultimately leading to the scientific revolution. So, the next time you check your calendar, remember that the precise knowledge underpinning it once resided almost exclusively in the hands of dedicated monks before it moved to the lecture halls of universities. Life in the medieval period was, to put it mildly, not always stable. It was a time of immense change, political upheaval, and devastating natural disasters. Yet amidst all this chaos, monastic communities largely managed to maintain their rigid calendrical routines. This section explores how these centers of quiet devotion navigated and endured such challenges, plagues, and resilience, all while stubbornly keeping time. Imagine a world suddenly gripped by the terror of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. This wasn't just a bad flu season. It was a devastating pandemic that wiped out an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population. Entire villages were decimated, trade routes collapsed, and societal structures frayed. Monasteries, with their communal living, were not immune. Many communities suffered catastrophic losses, with monks dying in droves. Yet, incredibly, the bells continued to chime, the prayers continued to be recited, and the calendars, though perhaps with fewer hands to copy them, continued to be meticulously maintained. A mainstream historical fact is that despite the immense loss of life and social disruption caused by the Black Death and subsequent outbreaks, the fundamental monastic routines, including the cycle of liturgical prayer and the adherence to the calendar, largely persisted. This speaks to the profound discipline and deep-seated commitment within these communities. Even if only a handful of monks remained, they would strive to maintain the full horarium, knowing their prayers were vital for a suffering world. It was the ultimate show-must-go-on attitude, but for their souls. Beyond plagues, monasteries faced other challenges. Wars, both internal, feudal conflicts, and larger international struggles, could sweep across the land, threatening monastic lands and disrupting daily life. Famines, caused by harsh winters or failed harvests, would test their self-sufficiency and challenge their charitable missions. Yet the calendar remained a constant, an anchor in a turbulent sea. It was a reminder of divine order, even when earthly order seemed to crumble. For a quirky tidbit, during particularly severe famines, some monastic calendars would include specific, desperate pleas for divine intervention, written in the margins next to the usual feast days. These brief, heartfelt prayers or notes about crop failures offer a poignant glimpse into the very real struggles these communities faced. Even as they upheld their calendrical duties, imagine jotting down "pray for rain" next to your Tuesday meeting. Historians still argue whether the monastic emphasis on routine and calendrical stability was a source of weakness, making them inflexible in times of crisis, or a core strength that allowed them to weather storms that shattered other institutions. Did their rigid adherence to schedule sometimes hinder pragmatic responses to disaster? Or was it precisely that unyielding discipline that provided comfort and continuity in a world turned upside down? It's a debate about resilience through rigidity versus adaptability. The very act of maintaining the calendar in such times of crisis was a profound act of faith. It was a statement that, despite human suffering and earthly chaos, God's time continued. His divine plan unfolded, and their duty was to remain aligned with it. This provided immense spiritual comfort and purpose, both for the monks themselves and for the wider society that looked to them for stability. The monks. By continuing their meticulous work on the computus and copying calendars, also ensured the survival of crucial knowledge. Even if a monastery was destroyed or its community scattered, the knowledge of timekeeping, of liturgical cycles, and of astronomical observation was replicated across numerous institutions. This redundancy, born out of widespread scribal activity, meant that calendrical science would not be lost even in the face of widespread catastrophe. They were the original distributed data storage system, with parchments as their hard drives. Consider the dedication it must have taken. A monk, perhaps weakened by illness or grieving the loss of brethren, still meticulously ruling lines, carefully inscribing dates, checking his calculations. This wasn't just a job. It was a sacred calling, a commitment that transcended personal hardship, the very act of engaging with the unchanging rhythms of the cosmos through the calendar, could have been a powerful antidote to the unpredictable and often terrifying realities of their physical world. This resilience was not just spiritual. Monasteries often had extensive land holdings and well-organized agricultural systems, making them more self-sufficient than lay communities. Their calendrical knowledge, therefore, wasn't just for liturgy, it was for survival. Knowing precisely when to plant or harvest could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation in a famine year. Their boring calendars literally kept them alive. So as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the quiet, determined monks, their candles flickering against the shadows of a plague-ridden night, or the distant sounds of war, yet still there. Quills scratch on, faithfully recording the passage of time, preserving knowledge, and reaffirming the enduring order of the universe through their humble calendars. They were the unsung heroes of continuity, measuring out the moments even when the world around them seemed to lose its measure. The centuries of observations, meticulous calculations, the debates, and the ever-growing awareness of the Julian calendar's drift finally culminated in one of the most significant overhauls of time in history, the Gregorian Revolution's genesis. While it happened long after the true medieval period ended, the seeds of this radical reform were sown, nurtured, and passed down through generations of those diligent monastic scholars. By the 16th century, the problem of the Julian calendars, inaccuracy had become undeniable and increasingly problematic. That 10-day error we discussed, by this point it had grown to a full 10 days off, meaning the vernal equinox, crucial for Easter, was occurring around March 11th instead of March 21st. This wasn't just a minor liturgical annoyance anymore. It was a glaring scientific discrepancy that undermined the very foundation of the Church's liturgical year. It was like trying to use a map that was off by 10 degrees, and your destination kept showing up in the wrong country. Very frustrating. For pilgrims, the push for reform gained momentum, driven by astronomers, mathematicians, and increasingly by the highest echelons of the Catholic Church. Several councils and commissions were convened over the centuries, trying to tackle the problem, but finding a universally acceptable solution was incredibly difficult. It wasn't just the scientific challenge, it was the political and theological minefield of getting various kingdoms and religious factions to agree. Imagine trying to get every country in the world to switch time zones on the same day. Yeah, it's like that, but with eternal damnation possibly on the line. The individual who finally decisively championed the reform was Pope Gregory XIII. In 1582, after decades of study and the work of brilliant astronomers and mathematicians like Aloysius Lilius and Christopher Clavius, He issued the papal bull Inter Gravisimas, introducing the Gregorian calendar. A mainstream historical fact is that this calendar reform involved two key changes. First, 10 days were simply skipped from the calendar. October 4th, 1582, was immediately followed by October 15th, 1582, to bring the equinox back to March 21st. And second, a new rule for leap years was introduced. A year is a leap year if it is divisible by 4, unless it is divisible by 100, but not by 400, to prevent future drift. It was a bold, unprecedented move. Imagine waking up and finding out 10 days of your life just vanished. It's a bit of a shock to the system. For a quirky tidbit, not everyone adopted the Gregorian calendar immediately or willingly. Protestant countries, suspicious of anything coming from the Catholic Pope, resisted the change for decades, some for centuries. This led to a period where different parts of Europe were literally operating on different dates. Imagine being a merchant trying to coordinate trade between Catholic France and Protestant England when it was October 15th in Paris. It was still October 5th in London. Talk about logistical nightmares. It's the ultimate different time zones problem, but on a macro, historical scale. Historians still argue whether the Gregorian reform was a triumph of scientific collaboration and papal authority, or if it also exposed the deep political and religious divisions within early modern Europe. Did it unify time, or did it highlight how fragmented the continent still was? It certainly did both, ultimately unifying time, but not without significant initial friction and resistance. The intellectual lineage from the medieval monks to the Gregorian reformers is clear. The reformers built directly upon the centuries of astronomical observation and computus studies conducted in monasteries and later in universities. The data on the equinoxes drift, the understanding of lunar and solar cycles, the very mathematical tools used to devise the new calendar, all had their origins in the diligent, it's often boring work of those cloistered scholars. They were the ones who kept the long-term data sets. The process of the reform was a testament to the power of accumulated knowledge. It wasn't a sudden flash of genius, but the careful synthesis of centuries of patient observation and incremental refinements. The monks, by highlighting the problem and preserving the methods of understanding it, were indispensable to the eventual solution. They were the unsung heroes who meticulously logged the bug report that finally got fixed centuries later. The Gregorian calendar stands as a monumental achievement of human ingenuity and collaboration, even if its adoption was messy. It demonstrates how a seemingly abstract problem, the drift of the calendar, could drive centuries of intellectual effort, eventually leading to a solution that impacts every single person on the planet today. When you check your phone and see July 7th, you are using a direct descendant of that monastic obsession. So, as you drift off, think of Pope Gregory, bold in his papal chair, but also of the countless, its unnamed monks, far removed from power, whose quiet, persistent work in cold scriptoriums made his reform even possible. Their legacy is literally every tick of the clock, every dated event, every passing moment in our modern world. They made sure we're all on the same page, chronologically speaking. And so, we arrive at the quiet end of our journey through medieval time. As you settle deeper into your sleep, let's reflect on the profound and often unacknowledged legacy of measured moments left to us by those medieval monks. Their obsession with calendars wasn't just a quirky historical footnote. It fundamentally shaped our modern understanding and experience of time itself. Think about it. Every single time you glance at a calendar today, whether on your wall, your computer, or your phone, you are benefiting from centuries of their patient, tireless work. The very structure of our week, the consistent cycle of months, the annual celebration of holidays all bear the indelible stamp of monastic influence. A mainstream historical fact is that the basic 7-day week, inherited from ancient traditions, was solidified and widely adopted throughout Europe thanks to its integration into the Christian liturgical calendar. Meticulously maintained by monastic communities, it gave structure to our days long before Monday morning dread was a thing. Their relentless pursuit of calendrical accuracy, driven by spiritual necessity, unexpectedly fostered rigorous intellectual discipline. They preserved astronomical knowledge, developed mathematical techniques, and created an infrastructure of learned communication that was unparalleled for its time. Without their boring calculations, the scientific progress that led to the Gregorian reform, and indeed much of later astronomy, would have been significantly delayed or simply impossible. They were the unsung, behind-the-scenes data entry specialists for the universe. For a quirky tidbit, even the way we commonly abbreviate days of the week or months on calendars sometimes echoes medieval Latin abbreviations. A subtle linguistic, ghosts from the scriptorium still haunting our digital displays. So, Jan, or Feb, might have a monastic ancestry you never suspected. Historians still argue whether the long-term effect of this monastic, calendrical obsession was ultimately a constraint on scientific freedom or a necessary prerequisite for later advancements. Did the Church's tight control over timekeeping stifle independent scientific inquiry? Or did it provide the stable, intellectually rigorous environment needed for such inquiry to flourish, even if within a specific framework? It's a nuanced debate, but what's undeniable is that the structure they provided was immense. The monks taught the world the profound importance of time, not just as a sequence of events, but as a sacred dimension. Their daily routines, dictated by the Herarium, ingrained a deep appreciation for the value of every hour, every moment. They lived in an era where time was not wasted, but offered, utilized, and accounted for with spiritual precision. You think twice about how you spend your own measured moments, doesn't it? The beauty of their illuminated calendars, as we saw, reminds us that even the most functional of tools can be elevated to art infused with meaning and aesthetic delight. They found beauty in order and spiritual significance in precision. Legacy isn't just in the numbers on our calendars, but in the very idea that time can be both a scientific construct and a profound spiritual journey. So, as your consciousness fades into the tranquil expanse of sleep, imagine the countless unnamed monks, their quills now silent, their calculations complete, their world seemingly so distant and slow, laid the very foundation for the highly synchronized, measured world we inhabit today. They were the original Time Lords, not with magical powers, but with quiet dedication. Ink, parchment, and an unshakable belief in the divine order of the universe. The soft hum of your fan, the quiet of your room, the gentle rhythm of your breathing, all exist within a temporal framework that these monks, in their unwavering devotion, painstakingly measured, preserved, and passed down. They ensured that when you wake, you'll know exactly what day it is. Ready to meet its measured moments? Rest now, knowing that the humble calendar, once the obsession of medieval monks, quietly continues its sacred duty, guiding your every moment, even in your dreams. Good night.